Corey Bubba Smith. His reign didn't last long, but for a brief moment in the 1990s, Corey Bubba Smith ruled over Miami's most dangerous neighborhoods with chilling precision. He was the mastermind behind one of Liberty City's most feared drug organizations, the John Doe Gang. What made Smith's rise so terrifying wasn't just the violence, though there was plenty of that, but the level of organization he brought to the streets. His crew turned Miami's neglected blocks into a well-oiled drug machine, fueled by cocaine, crack, and marijuana.
The largest violent drug group in Overtown and Liberty City.
The John Doe Gang wasn't your typical street operation. Smith ran it like a corporation, with roles assigned to every member, around-the-clock shifts, and an arsenal of high-powered weapons to protect their territory. They started around 1994 and quickly became a dominant force, muscling out rival dealers one block at a time. Anyone who tried to set up shop in Liberty City without Smith's blessing either paid the price or disappeared altogether. The gang's mix of business discipline and raw brutality made them almost untouchable. And the money reflected that power. One dealer in Smith's organization reportedly made as much as $23,000 in a single 12-hour shift, the kind of numbers that showed just how massive the crack trade had become in Miami during that era. When the FBI finally took Smith down, they seized over $185,000 in cash from his home alone. Smith demanded complete obedience from everyone under him. Any sign of weakness or disrespect was dealt with violently, no matter how small. One case that perfectly captured his ruthlessness involved a man named James Jackson. Jackson had stolen from a woman named Peggy King, who happened to have deep ties to Smith's gang. After realizing who she was connected to, Jackson panicked, returned what he stole, and personally apologized to Smith. But that wasn't enough. Smith felt disrespected, and in his world, disrespect demanded blood. To make an example out of Jackson, Smith sent his right-hand man, Latravis Gallashaw, to handle it. Gallashaw confronted Jackson and shot him 5 times. Miraculously, Jackson survived, but instead of seeing that as a sign to move on, Smith saw unfinished business. He learned that 2 other men, Octavius Bean Williams and Lamar Bally Newsom, had supplied Jackson with a gun used in the robbery. Smith viewed that as a threat to his authority and immediately ordered them killed. His enforcers, Julius Stevens and John Henry, tracked them down and opened fire on their car with assault rifles, killing both men instantly. Under Smith's leadership, the gang grew increasingly violent, and soon, bodies started piling up. Investigators eventually tied the organization to 7 murders that took place throughout the late 90s, each one carried out to maintain control or send a warning. But no matter how powerful he seemed, the walls around Smith began to close in. Federal authorities had been quietly building a case against him for years, and when they finally made their move, they brought his empire crashing down. Smith was convicted and sent to death row, but his legal saga didn't end there. What was supposed to be a clear-cut victory for prosecutors turned into one of the most controversial cases in Miami's recent history. During post-conviction reviews, it was discovered that one of his prosecutors, Michael Van Zandt, had made reckless and deeply inappropriate comments during a recorded jail call with one of Smith's associates. On the call, Van Zandt mentioned using Smith's former girlfriend, a woman known on the streets as the Black Widow, as a potential witness. His remarks hinted at manipulating or ever silencing her if she refused to cooperate, comments that raised serious questions about whether the state's case had been tainted by misconduct. When the details came to light, the judge ruled that the prosecutor's actions had compromised the integrity of the entire case. The first-degree murder convictions were thrown out, shocking both the public and the families of Smith's victims. One of those family members called it a complete miscarriage of justice, and many felt the same. But with decades having passed, witnesses gone, and evidence weakened by time, the state decided not to pursue a retrial. Instead, after spending more than 24 years behind bars, Smith pleaded guilty to reduced second-degree murder charges. During the hearing, the son of one of the victims, Angel Wilson, addressed him directly in court, telling him that regardless of who pulled the trigger, it was his organization that destroyed so many lives. Corey Bubba Smith, once the self-proclaimed king of Liberty City, had seen his empire collapse. He escaped the death penalty, but not the consequences of his actions. Today, he remains behind bars. Avonda Black Girl Dowling. She was one of the few women who built an empire in a world ruled by men. During the mid-1980s through the late 1990s, she ran over town with an iron grip, leading the feared crew known as Avonda's gang. Her rise from petty street hustler to full-blown queenpin was fast, brutal, and calculated.
Avonda's the only female in the crew that a lot of people thought they were going to walk over Avonda because she was a female.
Before her name started ringing through the streets, Dowling had a long history with the law. She was constantly in and out of jail for things like assault, theft, and weapons charges, nothing that would make her stand out at first glance. But everything changed when her husband, who had been running his own small drug operation, got locked up. Most people in her position would have laid low or tried to move on. Dowling did the opposite. She took over his business and then flipped it into something much bigger. Her biggest advantage came from a skill that, at the time, few people in Miami possessed. She knew how to cook crack cocaine. Around 1994, a Haitian man named Tony showed her how to transform powdered cocaine into crack, and that knowledge became the secret weapon that elevated her from small-time dealer to major supplier. She turned ordinary apartments into makeshift crack labs, cooking up batches that would flood over town streets. By the time other dealers figured out how to make crack themselves, Dowling already had a major start. Her operation ran like a franchise, open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, earning her comparisons to a Walgreens of cocaine. Running a drug empire required structure and fear, and Dowling understood that better than anyone. She kept her crew tight and loyal, surrounding herself with more than a dozen men, including her main enforcer, Robert Lee Sawyer, who everyone knew as Rah. He was her muscle, her problem solver, and sometimes her executioner. Anyone who crossed her or disrupted business didn't live long to talk about it. But the biggest threat to Dowling's empire came from another rising crew, the Boobie Boys, led by Kenneth "Boobie" Williams. Their rivalry exploded into one of the bloodiest turf wars in Miami's history. What started as a fight for territory quickly spiraled into open warfare, with both sides battling for control of the city's drug holes. The numbers from that war are staggering. Over 40 people were killed and more than 100 others were injured. Some sources claim the body count climbed past 60, with dozens more wounded. It wasn't unusual for victims to be hit by 50 or even 100 bullets. Innocent bystanders caught in the middle became collateral damage. In some neighborhoods, people were too scared to even walk to the store after dark. Double and triple murders happened so often that they barely made the news anymore.
Avonda went to war just as well as them dudes that went, you know what I mean? Avonda was a true gangster.
Dowling ruled through money and power. She didn't hesitate to order hits, and she made sure her killers were well compensated. One incident perfectly captured her cold-blooded leadership style. After Rah killed a rival named G. Rogers, he went straight to Dowling to report the hit. She rewarded him on the spot with $12,000 in cash and 1.5 kilos of cocaine. But the Boobie Boys weren't about to back down. They retaliated hard, targeting anyone connected to Dowling. One of her close associates, Jamal Brown, was ambushed and shot in the neck, leaving him paralyzed for life. The back-and-forth killings pushed Miami into a full-blown crisis. It got so bad that federal and local law enforcement had to join forces to form a special task force just to stop the bloodshed. The task force became relentless. They dug through old cases, reopened files, and hunted down anyone tied to either organization. Within months, they'd managed to take down a big chunk of the Boobie Boys, locking up about 25 members. Once the arrests started piling up, the violence in Miami's poorest neighborhoods dropped almost overnight. Some reports said by as much as 80%. For the first time in years, people could walk outside without constantly looking over their shoulders. Avonda's luck ran out not long after. She was finally arrested and brought to trial in 2003. Compared to the others who fell, many of whom were hit with life sentences or even faced the death penalty, Dowling got off relatively light. She was sentenced to 20 years in prison, a sentence many described as a miracle considering the level of violence tied to her organization. Even after her empire was dismantled, though, one mystery has continued to haunt investigators: the money. Despite seizing her operation and locking up everyone involved, the authorities never found the millions she made during her years on top. While Kenneth "Boobie" Williams was rumored to have buried his cash somewhere, Dowling had her own unique way of hiding her fortune. She supposedly stored her money in Tupperware containers, stashing them in places no one's ever found. She may have lost her freedom, but she walked away without ever giving up the secret to her hidden millions. Yahweh ben Yahweh. In the Miami of the 1980s, a new movement rose up that seemed, at first, like the answer to the community's prayers. They called themselves the Nation of Yahweh. Dressed in long white robes, wearing turbans, and carrying wooden staffs, they were a striking sight in the heart of Miami's historic black neighborhoods. To many, they looked like angels walking among the chaos, peaceful, organized, and deeply spiritual. Their leader was a man named Hulan Mitchell Jr., who had given himself a divine new identity, Yahweh ben Yahweh, which translates to God, the Son of God. In the beginning, the Nation of Yahweh didn't look like a threat. In fact, they were celebrated. While Colombian drug cartels and street gangs were tearing Miami apart, Yahweh's followers appeared to be rebuilding it. They brought up abandoned buildings, cleaned up neighborhoods, pushed out drug dealers, and provided food and shelter for the poor. They didn't drink, they didn't use drugs, and they carried themselves like a disciplined army of holiness. Local politicians and business leaders publicly praised their work. To many outsiders, it looked like Yahweh ben Yahweh was leading a moral revolution in a city drowning in sin and crime.
But on this day, Officer Ted Caracciolo watched the Yahwehs roll up, move in, and clean out the apartments here. And the Yahwehs say when they're done fixing the place up, it won't just house Yahwehs, but they won't just rent to anyone either.
Carefully screened application form that will determine people who are free from drugs.
But beneath that clean, disciplined exterior was something far darker. The public image was a carefully constructed mask. Behind the scenes, Yahweh ben Yahweh ruled with paranoia, manipulation, and violence. As his following grew, so did his ego and his hunger for control. He wasn't just interested in leading a church. He wanted to build a kingdom, one where his word was law and disobedience meant death. Those close to him began to see the shift. What started as spiritual devotion turned into blind obedience. Yahweh began to test his followers' loyalty by demanding impossible levels of commitment. He preached that he was the true and living God, and that anyone who opposed him, whether outsiders, rivals, or even disloyal members, were enemies who needed to be destroyed. One of the most chilling figures to emerge from the cult's inner circle was Robert Rozier, a former NFL player who became one of Yahweh's devoted soldiers. Rozier would later testify that he and others were trained to kill for their leader. They were orchestrated, premeditated hits carried out in the name of God. The followers called themselves the Death Angels, and their mission was to silence anyone who disrespected Yahweh or threatened his power. The murders tied to the Nation of Yahweh were some of the most disturbing crimes in Miami's history. Yahweh ben Yahweh was accused of ordering at least 14 killings, each carried out with shocking brutality. Victims were often targeted for betraying the group or speaking out against its leader. Some were shot, others stabbed, and at least one was beheaded.
Someone went against Yahweh, they were declared hypocrites. Then one of them showed up at the temple. He was beaten, tied up, wrapped in some kind of material, put in the trunk.
Trunk of a car?
Of a car. That's the last I saw him. And I read the next day in the paper that he was beheaded.
One man named Raymond Kelly was found stabbed to death, his body mutilated and his ears cut off. 2 more victims were gunned down at a housing complex the cult had recently taken over. At the same time, the group was building an empire. While they preached about righteousness and divine order, they were quietly making money through illegal means, from fraud and intimidation to extortion and money laundering. Yahweh ben Yahweh used this wealth to buy property across Miami, creating a network of safe houses, temples, and businesses that all fed into his growing influence. The money and loyalty of his followers allowed him to live like royalty, even as his teachings grew more extreme. Rumors began to swirl that Yahweh had reached far beyond Miami. Some investigators claimed to have found connections between him, Libya's Muammar Gaddafi, suggesting that Yahweh's movement had taken on an international dimension, though no solid proof of that alliance ever surfaced. Still, the speculation only added to the aura of danger that surrounded him. By the late 1980s, the facade was cracking. Former members began to defect and talk to authorities, revealing the true nature of life inside the Nation of Yahweh. The stories they told painted a terrifying picture of a man who had convinced hundreds that killing for him was killing for God. Finally, in November 1990, law enforcement made its move. Before dawn, SWAT teams surrounded the group's compound in Miami. When they raided the building, most of the members were still asleep, unaware that their so-called heaven on earth was about to collapse. Yahweh Ben Yahweh and 15 of his followers were arrested and later indicted on federal racketeering and murder conspiracy charges.
The self-proclaimed Son of God was arrested on Wednesday, charged with racketeering and giving the orders to kill 14 people.
The trial that followed pulled back the curtain on years of terror. Former disciples testified about the murders, the brainwashing, and Yahweh's complete psychological control over his flock. The once revered community leader who had promised salvation was revealed to be a manipulative cult leader who ruled through fear and violence. In 1992, Yahweh Ben Yahweh was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. His downfall marked the end of one of Miami's most bizarre and horrifying chapters. Anthony Little Bo Fail. He was once a major player in Miami's underworld. He wasn't just some street-level dealer, he held real power. As one of the high-ranking members of Corey Bubba Smith's crew, he was trusted and respected, running one of the city's most profitable drug holes on 61st Street. Before Bubba Smith even rose to full control, Fail had already built his name and controlled that corner, turning it into a cash factory. For a while, the two men coexisted peacefully. Fail had access to supply and could make his money without interference, but in the world they lived in, loyalty is fragile, and money always decides who stays on top. Eventually, the relationship crumbled. Smith decided to cut Fail off completely. No more supply, no more profits. For someone like Little Bo, that wasn't just about losing money, it was about respect. He saw Smith's order as a betrayal, a public humiliation that couldn't go unanswered. And so, he retaliated the only way he knew how, with violence. Fail declared war on his former allies, and that war spilled into the streets of Liberty City. He began targeting and robbing the very same drug spots that used to be under his control, hitting Smith's operation directly. What followed was months of chaos and bloodshed. Between August and December 1998, police linked Fail to at least a dozen murders. Each one was a message, a violent reminder that he wasn't going quietly. The weapons used during this period weren't handguns or street pistols. They were military-grade rifles, weapons designed for combat. Fail and his crew carried high-powered assault rifles firing 7.62 by 39 caliber rounds, capable of tearing through cars, walls, and anything in their path. The shootouts became frequent and unpredictable, leaving entire blocks paralyzed with fear. The violence didn't just touch those involved in the drug war, it started spilling over into the lives of innocent people. During one of the many shootouts, a stray bullet struck an 8-year-old girl named Tahani Farag. She had been inside her brother's convenience store when the shooting erupted outside.
This is the surveillance video Miami police are hoping will help them track down the shooter. You can see a man barreling over the counter. Right behind him is another man with a gun. 8-year-old Tahani Faraj was hit in the chest by a stray bullet. She is now recovering at Jackson Children's Hospital.
It hurt really bad.
By then, police knew they were dealing with a man on a mission. Fail wasn't hiding, he was lashing out, determined to take as many of his enemies down with him as possible. But his old crew wasn't sitting still either. Corey Bubba Smith wanted him gone, permanently. According to investigators, Smith ordered a hit to end the feud once and for all. The John Doe Gang, Smith's organization, tracked down a car they believed belonged to Little Bo. They ambushed it, unleashing a rain of gunfire. When the shooting stopped, the car was riddled with nearly 30 bullet holes. It looked like no one could have survived, but when the shooters approached, they realized they had made a devastating mistake. The driver wasn't Fail. It was his girlfriend, 26-year-old Angel Bennett Wilson. She had been killed instantly, caught in the middle of a war she had nothing to do with.
A grieving mother cries out for a 26-year-old daughter, Angel Bennett Wilson, cut down when 27 bullets from a high-powered assault rifle riddled her car.
After Wilson's murder, Anthony Little Bo Fail became the most wanted man in South Florida. The police described him as a cold-blooded killer with no conscience, a man who wouldn't hesitate to shoot his way out of any situation. But what made his case even more dangerous was that Fail wasn't just being hunted by the police. The John Doe gang still wanted him dead too. He was trapped between two sides that both wanted to take him down. Law enforcement launched a massive operation to capture him, calling it Operation Draw the Line. It was a coordinated effort between local police, federal agents, and SWAT teams. Still, Fail managed to stay one step ahead, constantly moving from one motel to another, switching rental cars, and avoiding any pattern that could give him away.
Meanwhile, Anthony Fail, also known as Little Bo, remains on the loose this morning, and police are still asking if you know anything about his whereabouts to give them a call.
But every run eventually comes to an end. The FBI finally caught a break when they received a tip about Fail's whereabouts. He was staying at a Days Inn motel in West Palm Beach, trying to keep a low profile. Agents found his rental car parked outside and quickly surrounded the area. The SWAT team didn't storm the room right away. They waited. When the pizza delivery man arrived, they knew it was the perfect moment. Fail had just started eating when they threw a stun grenade into the room, disorienting him before he could react. When the smoke cleared, the man who had once terrorized Miami streets was sitting on the floor, nervous and unarmed. The fugitive who had spent months dodging death had finally been captured without firing a single shot. Anthony Little Bo Fail was charged with multiple murders, including those tied to the gang war and the shooting of young Tahani Farag. Fail was convicted and sentenced to 2 life terms, ensuring that his violent reign over Miami would never happen again. Kenneth Boobie Williams. He was also known on the streets as Black. He was the co-founder of the Boobie Boys, a crew that law enforcement would later describe as one of the most savage and calculated drug gangs to ever come out of Miami. To really understand who the Boobie Boys were, you have to realize they weren't operating like your average corner gang. This was a criminal enterprise built with structure, strategy, and a staggering amount of violence. Williams grew up in the rough neighborhoods of Miami, places like Liberty City, Carroll City, and Overtown, areas that had long been shaped by poverty and crime. By the early 90s, he was already making noise in the streets, but the foundation for what would become his multi-million-dollar empire was laid in 1992, while he was locked up. It was there he met another inmate, Efrain Casado. The two hit it off, and once they got out, they decided to merge their networks and take their game to another level. What started as a small hustle quickly evolved into a sprawling organization that, at its peak, was estimated to be worth around $80 million. The Boobie Boys weren't just moving weight around Miami, they were moving it across the country. Their supply lines ran deep, stretching from Panama to the Bahamas and feeding cocaine into Florida before distributing it to over 25 cities in the state and at least a dozen other states across the US. They weren't local drug dealers. They were logistics masterminds with an international operation. To keep that kind of network running, they needed access and protection, and Williams made sure he had both. Through corruption at the port of Miami, the crew managed to smuggle massive quantities of cocaine into the US. One of their key associates, a longshoreman named Charlton Darcy's, even went as far as to obtain a fake US passport so he could personally travel to Panama to meet suppliers and arrange shipments. Everything was tightly controlled, from the docks to the distribution points. But what really made the Boobie Boys feared wasn't just the scale of their operation, it was their method of enforcing control. They ruled through terror. Their business model revolved around violence, and anyone who stood in their way was met with deadly consequences. Over the years, they were linked to more than 35 murders and over 100 shootings. The crew operated with military-like precision, rolling out in stolen cars, armed with AK-47s, wearing ski masks and camouflage as they executed their enemies and robbed rival dealers. Williams himself wasn't some distant boss giving orders from the shadows. He was hands-on. Court records would later link him directly to numerous murders. In 1994 alone, he and Casado were tied to the killings of Walter Betterson and Derek Harris, and Williams personally took part in the murder of Benny Brownlee. The bloodshed reached its peak when the Boobie Boys went to war with a rival crew known as Avonda's gang, led by Avonda Dowling. What followed was a violent turf war that turned entire neighborhoods into battlegrounds. The conflict left more than 60 people dead, and some victims were hit with nearly 100 bullets. Residents described it as a war zone where shootouts erupted in the streets and families lived in constant fear. Eventually, the chaos drew the full attention of federal law enforcement. A massive investigation was launched involving hundreds of witnesses and years of surveillance. The feds moved in hard, arresting dozens of members of the Boobie Boys. Williams, however, managed to slip away, becoming one of the most wanted men in America. His name and face were broadcast nationally on America's Most Wanted, with authorities linking him to as many as 15 murders. But his freedom didn't last. On May 17, 1999, after years on the run, he was finally captured in suburban Georgia. In the end, Kenneth "Boobie" Williams was convicted in federal court for running a continuing criminal enterprise and for committing murder to further his drug empire. The verdict sealed his fate, life in prison with no chance of parole. But even behind bars, his legacy hasn't faded. The Boobie Boys became street legends, their story echoing through Miami's underworld and even in hip-hop culture. Rappers like Rick Ross have dropped their name in songs. Mario Tabraue. He was a Cuban-American kingpin who built one of the most bizarre and terrifying empires of the 1980s. At his peak, federal prosecutors estimated he'd pulled in somewhere between $75 and $79 million in profits. To them, his operation was so organized, so sophisticated, that they nicknamed him the chairman of the board. But Mario claimed he didn't do it for the cars, the mansions, or even the power. As he once admitted, "I sold drugs to maintain my animal habit."
Back then, I sold drugs to maintain my animal habit.
That animal habit was no exaggeration. Tabraue was obsessed with exotic creatures, tigers, leopards, snakes, monkeys, anything wild and dangerous. It was this obsession that gave him the perfect front for his empire. He ran a legitimate-looking business called Zoological Imports Unlimited, which he used to mask his drug trafficking and money laundering activities. Behind the respectable name was a criminal network as wild as the animals he kept.
Mario Tabraue and his father Guillermo are accused of operating a 10-year top-dollar family drug enterprise.
His home in Coconut Grove was a sight straight out of a movie. Inspired by Tony Montana's mansion in Scarface, Tabraue's property was both luxurious and fortified. He had massive cats, actual leopards, and cheetahs roaming freely around his grounds, serving as his version of guard dogs. Anyone thinking about breaking in risked being mauled before even reaching the door. And he didn't stop there. Investigators were stunned to discover that Tabraue allegedly stored 10,000 pounds of marijuana inside one of Miami's most famous attractions, Parrot Jungle. While tourists were snapping pictures of parrots, hundreds of kilos of weed sat hidden behind the scenes. But it wasn't just the storage that shocked people. It was how he smuggled his product. According to one of his former employees, Tabraue's crew came up with one of the most disturbing smuggling methods imaginable. They would literally stuff bags of cocaine inside large snakes, sew them back up, and ship them overseas. It was an operation so cold-blooded and grotesque that investigators later gave it the nickname Operation Cobra. If this all sounds like Hollywood script, that's because it practically was. Tabraue's life mirrored Scarface so closely that many people believed he was one of the real-life inspirations for Tony Montana, and Mario himself loved to play into that image.
Sometimes they say that I'm the prototype for Scarface. The money coming in suitcases to the bank, I did that. But not with a fat guy in the band. It was a Corvette. I did it by myself. I would call the bank, and the banks, they would have 10 tellers who sit back there and count it. There was no counting machines.
Inside his Coral Gables mansion, the comparisons only got stronger. He had mirrored ceilings, marble floors, and even a giant leather throne monogrammed with his initials. But behind all the flash and animals was a man who ruled through fear and violence. Tabraue's organization didn't just run drugs, they corrupted the very system meant to stop them. Miami police officers were bribed, paid off, and effectively put on his payroll. He had protection from the inside, allowing his empire to run smoothly and without interference, at least for a while. That illusion shattered in July 1980 with one of the most brutal murders connected to his operation. Federal informant Larry Nash, who had been part of Tabraue's marijuana business, was caught talking to authorities. For Mario, that was an unforgivable sin. According to testimony, Nash was murdered, and what happened next was pure horror. Witnesses described how Tabraue first tried to dismember Nash's body with a machete. When that didn't work, one of his associates grabbed a chainsaw to finish the job. They stuffed the remains into a horse trough, poured in charcoal and lighter fluid, and burned what was left. And that wasn't the only murder tied to him. Just a year later, in 1981, Tabraue faced another accusation, this time for the death of his own wife, Maria. She had reportedly threatened to expose his drug activities, and according to prosecutors, Mario responded by shooting her 10 times. He stood trial for her murder, but incredibly, the jury couldn't reach a verdict. The case ended in a mistrial, and he walked free on that count. Even though he managed to dodge the murder charge, the law eventually caught up to him. In 1989, after years of surveillance, informants, and undercover operations, Mario Tabraue was finally convicted on 61 counts of racketeering. The sentence was staggering: 100 years in federal prison. Agents described him as one of the most ruthless and calculating traffickers Miami had ever seen. But in true Miami fashion, that wasn't the end of his story. Despite a century-long sentence, Tabraue only served 12 years behind bars. In a twist that shocked everyone, he struck a deal with federal authorities, offering to testify against other figures in the Miami underworld. His cooperation bought him his freedom.
The judge gave me 100 years, but I won the appeal. It cost me 12 years of my life.
When he walked out of prison in 2000, he didn't disappear quietly or change identities like other former traffickers. He went right back to what he loved most: animals. Today, Mario Tabraue runs an exotic animal sanctuary in Florida. Robert Lee Rah-Rah Sawyer. He was the cold-blooded enforcer of Avonda's gang in Overtown, and Rah-Rah was no ordinary foot soldier. He was the kind of man whose reputation preceded him, a figure the streets knew as a straight-up gangster, a shooter who never hesitated, and someone who genuinely had no fear in his heart. His presence alone was enough to make rivals think twice before making a move, but what truly defined him was his willingness to carry out high-stakes contract killings with precision and zero remorse. If there was a job that required bloodshed, Rah-Rah was the man Avonda Dowling trusted to handle it. Rah-Rah's name began to ring louder as Overtown's drug scene got more ruthless. By 1986, business was booming, and with money came competition. Rival dealers started creeping into Dowling's lucrative territory, threatening her operation. She needed to send a message. That's when she allegedly called on Rah-Rah. The target was a rival dealer named Michael McBride, and the job wasn't personal, just business. According to reports, Dowling put up 10 grand in cash and half a kilo of cocaine as payment for the hit. Rah-Rah didn't waste time. He tracked McBride down and took him out with a single gunshot. The murder not only eliminated the problem, but also cemented Rah-Rah's reputation as the gang's top enforcer, the man who made problems disappear. That hit marked a turning point. It set off a chain of violent events that spiraled into one of the bloodiest gang wars Miami had ever seen. The war between Avonda's gang and Kenneth "Boobie" Williams' crew, the Boobie Boys. What began as a turf dispute quickly turned into something far more personal. The spark came when the Boobie Boys murdered Rah-Rah's close friend, Wallace Fortner. From that moment, vengeance became his mission. From then on, Rah-Rah's life was like living in a constant battlefield. He developed bitter personal rivalries with Boobie Williams and one of his key lieutenants, Efrain Casado, known as E4. He reportedly threatened to kill them both after a series of drug-related disputes, and both sides took their threats seriously. The violence escalated fast. Rah-Rah survived several attempts on his life, including a wild highway ambush where the Boobie Boys riddled his vehicle with bullets from high-powered assault rifles. Somehow, he made it out alive, though badly wounded. Even while recovering from the hospital, danger followed him. According to Rah-Rah, his wife overheard members of the Boobie Boys in an elevator, plotting to finish the job and kill him in his hospital bed. That close call only fueled his rage further. He wanted payback, and he was going to get it. Then came New Year's Eve, December 31st, 1997. That night would go down as one of the most violent moments of this entire conflict. Rah-Rah spotted a Boobie Boys associate named Marvin Rogers out on the street. Without hesitation, Rah-Rah and one of his crew ran up on him and opened fire. Rogers went down after being shot with a pistol, but Rah-Rah wasn't done. He pulled out an AK-47 and unleashed a brutal volley, firing directly into Rogers' face and chest. When it was over, Rogers' body was left riddled with 23 bullet holes. For that ruthless execution, Dowling reportedly rewarded Rah-Rah with $12,000 and 1.5 kilos of cocaine. But that level of violence couldn't go unnoticed forever. The murder of Rogers drew serious attention from law enforcement. The feds had already been tracking the escalating war between the two groups, and after the New Year's Eve killing, the pressure intensified. Rah-Rah went on the run, fleeing to Tallahassee to lay low, but it was only a matter of time before the law caught up with him. When they finally did, Rah-Rah faced the grim reality of spending the rest of his life behind bars. Dozens of murders, drug trafficking, and organized crime charges were stacked against him. He knew what life sentences looked like. He'd seen enough of his friends and enemies go down for good. And that's when Rah-Rah flipped. Breaking the street code of silence, Rah-Rah decided to cooperate with federal investigators. He testified before a grand jury, laying out the violent inner workings of Avonda Dowling's empire and the deadly war they waged against the Boobie boys. His testimony helped prosecutors piece together one of Miami's most brutal underworld stories. In exchange for his cooperation, Rah-Rah was given a 40-year plea deal. It was still a long stretch, but compared to the life sentences his rivals and some of his own crew received, Latravis Trav Gallashaw. He was the cold, capable second-in-command of the John Doe gang, the man who kept the entire operation running like a well-oiled machine. Gallashaw wasn't just muscle. He was brains and backbone combined. From 1994 to 1999, he managed the day-to-day operations of one of Liberty City's most organized and dangerous drug enterprises. While the gang's leader, Corey Smith, was the face and strategist, Trav was the one handling the gritty details, the money, the muscle, and the murders that kept their empire alive. The John Doe gang wasn't some ragtag street crew. It was a structured, almost corporate-style organization built around the distribution of cocaine, crack, and marijuana. Gallashaw's role was that of an operations manager. He made sure everything flowed smoothly from the corners to the cash stash. He supervised lieutenants, managed the gang's 7 drug holes, and tracked every dollar and gram that passed through their network. At the end of each shift, he made sure all money was counted, all product was accounted for, and every worker knew their place. When federal agents finally cracked down on the organization, the scale of its operation became clear. A raid on a house registered to Smith but used by Gallashaw revealed the blueprint of a criminal enterprise: $16,000 in cash, bags of cocaine and marijuana, and tally sheets documenting their sales like business ledgers. In that world, respect was everything, and discipline was non-negotiable. Gallashaw was the enforcer of that code, the man who made sure no one stepped out of line, but his version of discipline was brutal. When one of the gang's lower-level dealers, Marlon Benaby, was caught selling his own stash on the side, Gallashaw took it as a betrayal that couldn't go unpunished. He and another member decided to make an example out of Benaby. What was supposed to be a beating turned into a tragedy. During the assault, Gallashaw tried to pistol whip him, but the gun went off. The bullet struck Benaby, leaving him paralyzed. He survived for a while as a quadriplegic, but later died from complications. Gallashaw, determined to tie up loose ends, eventually ordered his murder. It was a cold reminder of how quickly a lesson in loyalty could turn into a death sentence. Gallashaw was also the man Corey Smith turned to when it came to handling threats from the outside. One of the most chilling examples of this came when a man named James Jackson robbed an associate of the John Doe gang. Smith didn't hesitate. He gave the order to make it right, and Gallashaw carried it out without blinking. He found Jackson and shot him 5 times. Miraculously, Jackson survived. For years, Gallashaw helped maintain the gang's grip on Liberty City through a mix of fear, precision, and ruthless enforcement. But ironically, his name would end up attached to one of the biggest legal scandals in Miami's criminal justice system, a fiasco that nearly destroyed the state's case against his boss, Corey Smith. After the organization was dismantled and Gallashaw found himself behind bars, a strange and incriminating event unfolded. While in jail, he spoke on a recorded phone call with prosecutor Michael Van Zandt, who was preparing Smith's trial. The two discussed a key witness, Smith's ex-girlfriend Trisha Jeter, better known on the streets as the Black Widow. What was supposed to be a routine conversation quickly spiraled into something far more sinister. During the call, Van Zandt made a chilling remark about the witness, saying he'd find a way to make her unavailable if she refused to testify. Those words would come back to haunt him. When the recording surfaced in court, it painted a devastating picture. The judge didn't believe the prosecutor literally meant to order a hit, but he admitted that any reasonable person could interpret it as a threat. The fallout was massive. The entire prosecution's credibility crumbled. The scandal forced the removal of the prosecutor and caused Smith's first-degree murder conviction to be thrown out. What was once a rock-solid case built on years of investigation unraveled because of one reckless phone call that Gallashaw happened to be a part of. Even though the fiasco didn't erase Gallashaw's crimes, it cemented his name in legal infamy. He was convicted on federal charges, including conspiracy to distribute cocaine and marijuana. But the way the jury's verdict was structured made sentencing tricky. Because they didn't specify which drug was the primary focus of the conspiracy, the maximum sentence became legally complicated. Initially, Gallashaw was hit with a life sentence, but fate had other plans. After years behind bars, he was released in 2012. For a brief moment, it looked like the story of Latravis Trav Gallashaw might end quietly, but by 2017, he was back in custody once again.